I was never one for camping, but my brother Eric was the outdoorsy type. He had been begging me for years to join him on a trip, and after a rough couple of months at work, I finally caved in. It was the fall of 2019, and we decided on a remote spot in Montana, far from the noise of the city. Eric had been there once before with some friends and swore it was one of the most peaceful places he had ever been. I figured some fresh air and a weekend away from emails and phone calls wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. We packed up his truck with everything we'd need: tents, sleeping bags, food, a first aid kit, and enough firewood to last us the weekend. I had never been to this part of Montana before, but the drive was beautiful. We were surrounded by endless stretches of pine trees and mountains that looked untouched by time. The further we drove, the more isolated we became. Eventually, the paved roads turned to gravel, and an hour later, we were on a barely visible dirt path, our truck bouncing over the uneven ground. When we arrived, the place was as beautiful as Eric had described. A small clearing sat beside a crystal-clear lake, and beyond that, nothing but forest for miles. There was no cell service, which made me a little uneasy, but Eric assured me we were prepared for anything. He pulled out a map and pointed to a ranger station about 5 miles away in case of emergency. It was reassuring to know we weren't completely alone. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents near the water and gathering firewood before the sun dipped behind the trees. The first night was uneventful, just the two of us sitting by the fire, drinking cheap beer, and reminiscing about our childhood. The air was crisp, the stars were brighter than I had ever seen, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely relaxed. But that feeling didn't last. The next morning, I woke up to find Eric already up, making coffee over the fire. He told me he had heard something in the woods during the night. Branches snapping, heavy footsteps. I laughed it off, saying it was probably just a deer, but something about the way he looked at me made my stomach tighten. We spent the day hiking, exploring the area, and fishing in the lake. Everything felt normal. The tension from the morning faded, and by the time the sun started to set, I had almost forgotten about it. But as we sat by the fire again that night, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange sensation like we were being watched. Eric must have felt it too because he kept glancing over his shoulder. The fire crackled between us, and the only other sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, just as I was about to say something, we both heard it. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate ones moving just beyond the firelight. We both went still, listening. Then silence. Nothing but the sound of our own breathing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the trees. There was nothing there. Eric stood up, scanning the woods, his hand resting on the knife strapped to his belt. "Maybe a bear," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We didn't hear anything else that night, but neither of us slept well. I lay awake in my tent, listening, waiting. Every creak of a tree, every rustling leaf sent my heart racing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, we found footprints near our camp. Human footprints. They were fresh, leading from the tree-line to where we had been sitting the night before, then back into the woods. I felt sick. Someone had been watching us. I wanted to pack up and leave, but Eric was determined to stay. If they wanted to do something, they would have already, he reasoned. It wasn't comforting. That day, we carried our knives everywhere, stayed close to camp, and kept our voices low. The unease never left. As night fell, we built the fire bigger than before, hoping it would keep whoever or whatever away. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise, a low, dragging sound. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had died down, casting only faint, flickering light over the campsite. And then I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. They were still watching. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't see their face, just a dark silhouette against the trees. Slowly, they stepped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally snapped out of it and scrambled over to Eric's tent, shaking him awake. "We're leaving. Now." We didn't bother packing up properly. We grabbed our essentials, threw them into the truck, and sped out of there. The whole drive back, neither of us spoke. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, miles away from the campsite. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. We never found out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe they were just curious. Or maybe they were waiting for something, waiting for us to fall asleep to let our guard down. I haven't been camping since. The sun hung low in the sky as I turned off the main highway and onto the long gravel road that led deep into the Oregon wilderness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as my tires crunched over the loose rock. I had planned this trip for months, needing a break from the constant noise of the city, and I had chosen this isolated stretch of land because it was far from everything. Just me, my truck, and the endless stretch of pine trees. I had always liked being alone, but there was something about this place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour, or maybe it was just the eerie quiet that settled over the landscape as the sun started to dip below the trees. But I ignored the feeling, pushing it aside as nerves. I was here to enjoy the outdoors, not spook myself with silly thoughts. I pulled into a small clearing just off the gravel road, a spot I had marked on my map weeks ago. Tall trees surrounded the open space, and a small river cut through the landscape just beyond the tree line. It was perfect. I parked the truck, stretched my legs, and got to work setting up my tent before darkness could creep in. By the time I had everything settled, the air had grown crisp. I started a fire, the orange glow casting flickering shadows against the surrounding trees. I sat back in my camp chair, eating a sandwich and listening to the distant rustling of leaves. The sound of the river was calming, a steady hum in the background, blending with the occasional crackle of my fire. I told myself there was nothing to be nervous about, but as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't right. I had camped alone before in more remote places than this, but I had never felt this strange sense of unease. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something was off. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. I hadn't heard the usual sounds of night. No crickets, no owls, nothing but the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I tried to ignore it, shaking my head at my own paranoia. I climbed into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, determined to get some rest. The fire outside had burned low, casting a faint glow against the fabric of my tent. I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle rush of the river, and forced myself to relax. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke suddenly to a sound outside my tent. My eyes snapped open, my breath catching in my throat. It was a soft sound, barely audible over the river. A crunch of leaves, the snap of a small twig. I held my breath, my body tense. Could have been an animal. It was probably an animal, but something about the sound felt deliberate. I listened, straining my ears, but the sound didn't come again. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the small knife I kept in my backpack, gripping it tightly. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, every nerve in my body on edge. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted back into uneasy sleep. I woke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the trees. For a moment, I lay still, trying to remember why I felt so tense, and then it all came rushing back. The noise, the feeling of being watched. I sat up slowly, listening. The forest had come alive again, the distant call of birds, the rustle of wind in the leaves. Everything seemed normal, but that didn't mean it was. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, stretching my stiff muscles. The fire had long since burned out, leaving behind a pile of ash. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling that still clung to me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been a raccoon or a deer. I was probably being ridiculous. But then I saw it. Footprints. Human footprints in the dirt just beyond my tent. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, as if someone heavy had been standing there, watching. My stomach twisted, and a cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck. I scanned the trees, my heart hammering. There was no one there, but someone had been. Someone had stood outside my tent in the middle of the night, close enough to hear me breathing, and I had never heard them leave. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, shoving everything into the back of my truck. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the gravel road, my tires kicking up dust as I sped away. I drove for miles before I finally let myself breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it had been a hiker, lost in the woods. Maybe it was a hunter, passing through. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. Whoever it was had stood outside my tent for a long time, long enough to leave deep impressions in the dirt. They hadn't called out, hadn't made their presence known. They had just watched. I never went back to that campsite. I never even looked up that area again. Whatever had happened that night, I didn't want to know. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never in a place that isolated. Because now I know I wasn't alone out there, and I don't ever want to find out who was watching me. I was never someone who got scared easily. I grew up hiking, fishing, and camping, spending more nights under the stars than in my own bed during the summers. So when my friend James invited me on a weekend camping trip deep in the Montana wilderness, I didn't hesitate. He had found an old trail leading to a lake that, according to him, hardly anyone visited. It sounded perfect. We left early on a Friday morning in late September. The drive took us 6 hours, most of it spent on winding dirt roads cutting through dense forest. Our final destination was a narrow pull-off near the entrance to an unmarked trail. The plan was simple: hike in about 7 miles, set up camp near the lake, fish, relax, and head back Sunday morning. The first few miles of the hike were uneventful. The trail was overgrown but not impassable. It was clear that nature had been reclaiming the path for years. We moved steadily, stopping every so often to check the map and drink water. The further we went, the quieter the forest became. It wasn't just the absence of people, the total lack of sound. No birds, no insects, nothing. By late afternoon, we reached the lake. It was beautiful but unsettling in its stillness. The water was dark and unmoving, surrounded by thick trees that cast long shadows. There were no signs of other campers, no old fire pits, no footprints. It felt like no one had been here in decades. We set up camp near the treeline, about 30 yards from the water. As the sun started setting, we built a fire and cooked dinner. The silence of the place still bothered me. Even as the fire crackled, the woods remained eerily quiet. Every so often, I'd glance into the trees, expecting to see something watching us, but there was nothing. That night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the wind or small animals. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. James was still asleep. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I stayed still, waiting, my heartbeat loud in my ears. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away, back toward the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I told James. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably an animal. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. We spent the day fishing and exploring, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the treeline. Something felt off. That evening, we built another fire and sat in silence, eating our catch. The quiet of the forest was oppressive. I was about to suggest turning in early when James suddenly tensed. "Did you hear that?" I listened. First, I heard nothing. Then, faintly from the darkness, whispers. We both stood up, shining our flashlights into the trees. The sound stopped. My stomach twisted. It hadn't been the wind. It had been voices. Low, hushed, like people talking just out of earshot. James muttered something about checking it out, but I grabbed his arm. No, we stay here. We sat by the fire, our backs to the tent, weapons close. The hours dragged on. Every now and then, I thought I heard movement in the distance, but nothing came close. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we took turns keeping watch. Sometime in the early morning, I dozed off. When I woke up, the fire was almost out, and James was sitting stiffly, staring into the woods. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn cold. Footprints, deep, fresh, circling our camp. They hadn't been there before. We packed up in record time. Neither of us spoke much. The hike back was grueling, but we didn't stop. The entire way, I felt like something was behind us, just out of sight. We made it back to the truck, threw our gear in, and sped off. We never talked about it again. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know we weren't alone out there. I don't know why I agreed to go. I never liked camping much. It's not that I was scared of the woods, but I just never saw the appeal. Maybe it was the hassle of packing up food, tents, gear, only to spend a night on the hard ground, vulnerable to the cold, the bugs, and whatever else was out there. But my friend James insisted. He had been planning this trip for months, and after enough pestering, I finally gave in. It was early October, the air crisp but not too cold yet. The trees had turned, their leaves scattered in fiery reds and oranges. James, his younger brother Danny, and I loaded up his old Jeep and headed out to a remote spot in West Virginia, deep in Monongahela National Forest. James had heard about it from a coworker, some hidden spot near a small, unused trail that led to a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The way he talked about it, you'd think it was paradise. The drive took hours. The roads twisted through dense forest, and the farther we went, the worse they got. Cracked pavement turned into gravel, which turned into dirt, until finally we were bouncing over uneven, washed-out trails. James swore he knew where he was going, but I had my doubts. My phone lost service an hour back, and I hated the feeling of being completely cut off. No towns, no signs, nothing. Just the trees and us. When we finally pulled up to the trailhead, the sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. We grabbed our packs and hiked in about a mile before finding the clearing. It was nice, I'll admit. The creek bubbled softly nearby, the trees stretched high above us, and the place had a quiet stillness to it. We set up camp quickly, getting a fire going before the sun fully set. For a while, it was normal. We ate, joked around, and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. James brought a bottle of whiskey, and we passed it between us. It felt like any other camping trip. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire was just embers now, barely glowing in the dark. My sleeping bag was zipped up tight, the air cold against my face. Everything was silent. Then I heard it, a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. I turned my head slowly toward the tent door, trying to see out through the small mesh window. The forest was black beyond the glow of the dying embers. I saw nothing, heard nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I must have been half asleep, I told myself. Maybe an animal, a deer, nothing to worry about. I rolled over, pulling my sleeping bag tighter, and closed my eyes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I didn't mention it. James and Danny were already up, making breakfast. Everything seemed normal, and I wasn't about to admit that I'd been scared by some noises in the woods. We ate, hiked around a bit, fished in the creek, and by afternoon I had mostly forgotten about it. That night, though, it happened again. I woke up suddenly, like before, my heart already pounding. I listened. Nothing at first. Then a noise. Not footsteps this time, but something softer, slower. A dragging sound, like something being pulled through the leaves. I sat up, my pulse hammering. The sound came from just outside the tent. I strained my ears, trying to place it, but it stopped. The silence was worse. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it toward the tent wall. The thin fabric glowed white under the beam, but I couldn't see anything beyond it. I swallowed hard, debating whether to unzip the tent and look outside. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Person? Some kind of sick joke? After what felt like forever, I heard the sound again, this time farther away. Whatever it was moving off into the woods. The next morning, I finally told James. He just laughed. "Probably a raccoon," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Or a bobcat. They're around here." I didn't argue, but I knew that wasn't it. I've heard raccoons and bobcats before. This was different. This was deliberate. I almost suggested we leave that day, but I didn't want to sound like an idiot. So we stayed. One more night. That evening, we stayed up later than before. I kept glancing into the woods, trying to catch movement. Nothing. Eventually, Danny and James turned in, and I was left alone by the fire. I wasn't tired. I didn't want to sleep, but eventually I had to. I zipped myself into the tent, gripping my flashlight tight in my hand. I told myself it was fine, that I was imagining things. I had almost convinced myself, too, until sometime in the dead of night, I woke up to something pressing against the side of the tent. It wasn't hard, not like a hand or a paw, but there was weight behind it. A slow, steady pressure that pushed the fabric inward, as if something was leaning against it. I couldn't move. I just lay there, frozen, my breath stuck in my throat. Then, just as slowly, the pressure lifted. I wanted to wake James and Danny, but I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe. I kept staring at the tent wall, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, I drifted into a restless sleep. When the sun rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I expected to see tracks or some sign of what had happened, but there was nothing. Just the quiet woods, the morning light streaming through the trees. That was enough for me. "We need to go," I said. I didn't care if I sounded paranoid. James saw the look on my face and didn't argue. We packed up fast. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching us from the trees. But there was nothing. We hiked back to the Jeep in silence. As soon as we hit the road, I felt relief wash over me. The farther we got from that place, the easier I could breathe. I still don't know what it was. An animal? Maybe. But I've been in the woods plenty of times, and I've never felt fear like that before. I won't go back to that spot. I don't want to know what was out there, and I don't think I ever will. The sun was setting as I pulled off the narrow gravel road and into the clearing where I planned to camp for the night. It was late August, the kind of evening where the heat still clung to the air but had started to give way to the first hints of fall. I had been driving for hours, looking for a secluded spot somewhere deep in the Tennessee wilderness. I wanted quiet. No campgrounds, no other people, just me, my truck, and my tent under the stars. I found the spot by accident. A small opening in the trees just wide enough for my truck to squeeze through. A faint dirt path led off from the main road, winding through dense forest before spilling into a flat, open area surrounded by thick pine trees. It looked perfect, remote, and undisturbed. After parking, I stepped out and stretched, breathing in the earthy smell of pine needles and damp soil. The forest was alive with the sounds of cicadas and the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. I set up my tent near my truck, leaving enough space for a fire but keeping everything close together. This deep in the woods, it was best to stay within reach of my gear. By the time I had everything set up, darkness was settling in. The temperature had dropped slightly, just enough to be comfortable. I built a small fire, not for warmth but for the light and the simple comfort of it. Sitting by the fire, I ate a quick meal and leaned back against a log, watching the flames dance. It was peaceful. Then I heard it, a single, sharp snap in the woods behind me. Not the usual rustling of small creatures or the wind shifting through the trees. This was deliberate, the sound of something heavy stepping on a branch. I sat up, my body tensing. I listened, my ears straining against the quiet that followed. Nothing. I shook it off. It was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but I kept the fire going a little longer than planned, just in case. Eventually, I forced myself to get into the tent. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest had returned to its usual nighttime chorus. Lying on my sleeping bag, I tried to let the fatigue from the long drive take over, but I was on edge. Every little sound seemed amplified in the silence. I told myself it was just my nerves. Then came another sound. This time it was different, closer. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Then another, and another. Someone was walking just beyond the trees. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. My truck was locked, but my keys were inside my tent, zipped up in my backpack. If I had to get out, I'd need to move fast. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear anything, breathing, movement, anything that would tell me what was out there. But the forest had gone dead silent. Even the cicadas had stopped. Minutes passed. I didn't move. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, maybe another camper who wandered too far from their sight. But no one was supposed to be out here. That was the point of coming this deep into the woods. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my body rigid, every sound sending another jolt of adrenaline through me. Eventually, exhaustion won out. My body gave up before my mind did, and at some point, I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up suddenly, my body alert before my mind caught up. Something had changed. I could feel it. The air inside the tent felt heavy, thick with something unseen. I listened. First, nothing. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Right outside my tent. It was slow, deep, controlled. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the thin fabric separating me from the night. The weight of it pressed against the air, a presence I could feel without seeing. My stomach twisted with fear. I stayed still. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind screamed at me to grab my knife, my keys, anything, but I couldn't. If I moved, it might hear me. I listened to the breathing, each inhale and exhale measured. Steady. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting. Then the zipper started slow, teeth separating one by one. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. My blood turned to ice. My body moved before my brain did. I lunged for my backpack, yanking it open and scrambling for my keys. The zipper moved faster now, urgency replacing patience. I grabbed my knife in one hand, my keys in the other, and with every ounce of strength I had, I threw myself against the tent wall, knocking it over as I tore my way free. I hit the ground hard but didn't stop. I bolted for my truck, my fingers fumbling to hit the unlock button. Behind me, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the brush. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The truck lights flashed as the doors unlocked, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door and locking it in one motion. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, twisting hard. The engine roared to life. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty space where my tent had been. But there was no one there. No movement, no sound. Just my overturned tent and the smoldering remains of my fire. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, tires kicking up dirt as I backed out of the clearing and onto the narrow path. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering. I drove, too fast for the rough road, the truck bouncing violently as I sped away from whatever had been out there. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe, my hands still gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. I sat there for a long time, the fluorescent lights of the station washing over me, grounding me back in reality. I never went back for my tent. I never even looked at the map to see exactly where I had been. I didn't want to know. All I know is that someone was out there that night, and they were watching me. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 24 when my brother Jake and I decided to go camping deep in the woods of northern Montana. We had been planning a week-long trip for months, eager to get away from the stress of work and city life. Jake was always more adventurous than me, pushing for hikes in remote locations, while I was fine sticking to well-marked trails. But this time, we both agreed on something different, a real off-the-grid experience. We packed our gear, double-checked our supplies, and made the 5-hour drive into the wilderness. The last 40 miles were on a dirt road, the kind that rattled your teeth and sent dust clouds billowing behind the truck. We had a topographical map, a compass, and Jake's GPS, but there was no cell service. That was fine. We wanted isolation. By late afternoon, we found a clearing beside a slow-moving river. It was perfect, far from any designated campgrounds, quiet except for the occasional rustling of trees and chirping of insects. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and boiled some water for instant coffee. The first night was uneventful. We sat by the fire, talked about work, old friends, and our childhood camping trips with Dad. The stars were out, clear and sharp, and there was something peaceful about being that far from civilization. I slept well, only waking up once to the distant howl of a coyote. The second day, we decided to explore. We hiked for hours, following the river upstream, weaving through thick underbrush and climbing over fallen logs. Around midday, we came across something strange. In a small clearing, there was an old fire pit with blackened stones, a few rusted cans, and what looked like the remains of a sleeping bag, torn to shreds. It had been there a while. Jake joked about it being a bear attack, but I didn't find it funny. The air felt heavier there, like the forest was watching us. We moved on, eventually reaching a small rocky hill with a great view of the valley. We ate our lunch and started back toward camp, but we got turned around. The trees all looked the same, and the river seemed farther away than it should have been. Jake checked the GPS, and we adjusted our course, but something felt off. When we finally made it back, the sun was already setting. I was exhausted. Jake started the fire while I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the river to wash up. As I crouched by the water, I noticed something across the river. A shape in the trees, just past the edge of my light. I froze. It didn't move. Maybe it was just a shadow or my tired mind playing tricks on me. I stayed there for a long moment, staring, until the wind shifted and leaves rustled. I turned back to camp without looking again. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound made my heart jump. Branches creaked in the wind. Something splashed in the river. Once, I thought I heard soft footsteps outside the tent, but when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing, just my own pulse pounding in my ears. The third day, we planned to hike farther upstream, but I felt uneasy. I suggested we pack up and move to a different spot. Jake rolled his eyes but agreed. As we gathered our gear, I kept glancing toward the trees, that feeling of being watched growing stronger. As we hiked back toward the truck, we saw something new. Near the old fire pit, about 50 yards deeper into the woods, there was a structure. Not a cabin, not even a shack, just a crude wooden frame covered with a tarp. It looked abandoned, but the tarp was relatively new, not sun-bleached or torn. Around it, bones were scattered. Not human, I told myself that immediately, but deer, maybe. Some still had bits of flesh clinging to them. Jake stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm. Let's go. We didn't talk much after that. We moved fast, checking over our shoulders more than necessary. When we reached the truck, I didn't relax until the engine turned over and we were moving. The drive back to the main road felt longer. The whole way, I kept expecting to see something in the trees, some figure standing just out of sight. But we never did. We never reported what we found. Who would we even tell? It wasn't a crime to camp in the woods, and maybe someone had just left that place behind. But something about it felt wrong. For weeks after, I had nightmares about that clearing, about standing in front of that tarp-covered frame, hearing footsteps behind me. I never turned around in the dream, but I always woke up feeling like I should have. Jake wanted to go back the next summer. I refused. He laughed it off, but I could tell he was disappointed. He stopped bringing it up eventually. I still camp, but never that deep. Never without a way to leave quickly. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, When the fire is dying and the woods are too still, I think about that place. About the feeling of eyes in the dark. About the things people leave behind. I never liked camping, but I agreed to go because my brother, Josh, wouldn't shut up about it. He had been begging me for months to take a weekend off work and join him on a trip into the mountains. I finally gave in, thinking it would be a good way to clear my mind. The plan was simple. A 3-day trip, just the two of us, deep in the forest of Colorado's San Juan Mountains. We left early on a Friday morning, my truck loaded with gear, food, and enough supplies to keep us comfortable. Josh had picked a spot miles from any marked trail, a place he had read about in some online forum. No one goes there, he told me. It's perfect. The drive took longer than expected. The dirt roads got worse the deeper we went, narrow and rutted from the spring rains. My truck bounced over rocks and potholes, the tires spitting up mud. By the time we reached the spot, the sun was beginning to set behind the ridgeline. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent on a flat patch of dirt near a small clearing. The forest was thick around us, towering pines pressing in from all sides. A small stream trickled nearby, just close enough for us to hear it over the quiet of the woods. There was no one else around. That was the appeal, I guessed. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, ate, and talked about stupid things, old friends, work, life. The stars were bright, clearer than I had seen in years. I went to bed feeling more at ease than I had expected. The next morning, Josh wanted to hike. He had a route planned out, some old logging road that led up the ridge. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I went along. The trail was rough, barely visible in places, overgrown with ferns and saplings. As we climbed, I noticed something strange. The forest felt off. It wasn't just the quiet, though that was part of it. There was no birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. The trees felt too close, their branches tangled together in a way that blocked out the sun. The deeper we went, the worse it got. I felt a pressure in my chest, a growing unease that I couldn't explain. Then we found the cabin. It was old, barely standing. The roof had caved in on one side, the walls dark with rot. No windows, just empty holes where glass had once been. It looked abandoned for decades, maybe longer. Josh was excited, eager to explore. I wasn't. Something about it felt wrong. The door was half open, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the smell hit me first. Rot, mold, something else I couldn't place. The floor was littered with debris. Fallen beams, old furniture, scraps of cloth. But what got me was the back wall. Carvings, deep, erratic gouges in the wood. Not words, just shapes, lines, some overlapping, some fresh. I touched one and felt splinters break off into my skin. "This is cool as hell," Josh said, running his fingers over them. I didn't agree. My stomach twisted. The air inside was thick, damp, heavy. I wanted out. Then we saw the bones, piled in the corner, half buried under debris. Animal, I told myself. Had to be. But they were big. Too big. I didn't look long enough to know for sure. I grabbed Josh's arm. "Let's go." He wanted to stay, but I wasn't about to argue. Something about that place made my skin crawl. I kept glancing over my shoulder as we walked back, expecting to see something watching us from the trees. I didn't, but the feeling never left. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those carvings, those bones. I lay awake, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, the woods still eerily quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the trees. I held my breath. They moved closer, circling the campsite. Not an animal. Too steady, too careful. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Josh was asleep, unaware. I didn't move, just listened. The footsteps stopped. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Josh. He didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. We spent the day fishing, trying to enjoy what was left of the trip. But the feeling never left me. That night, it happened again. This time, I woke up to the sound of something outside the tent, breathing, low, slow, just inches from the fabric. My heart pounded. I stayed still, knife in hand, barely breathing myself. Then the tent moved, a slow press against the fabric, like a hand dragging across it. I almost screamed. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I grabbed Josh, shaking him awake. "We're leaving," he argued, groggy and annoyed. But I wasn't listening. I threw our gear into the truck, heart hammering. I didn't care about packing properly. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. As we drove away, I felt it again, that same pressure, that same weight. Like something was watching, like something was following. We didn't talk the whole drive back. I don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing. Maybe just my imagination. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back.